Hey guys, welcome to the Deeper Bible Podcast. It is exactly what it sounds like. We want to go deeper into the scriptures, into big ideas in the history of theology, philosophy, culture, how it all lands in our life today. Super excited that you're here. And today is, I am very excited to have a friend with me on the show who's been in my life for almost 20 years. He's a mentor. He's a Christian thought leader. He's the president of my alma mater, Northwest University in Kirkland, Washington, greater Seattle area. His name is Joe Castleberry. And Joe, I'm going to brag about you for a second so you don't have to fill in any details. So Joe was a missionary in Latin America for 20 plus years, has a real pastor's heart, has been president of Northwest for I think about 17 years. He came on when I was, I think, a sophomore there. And he has his doctorate from Columbia, his master's from Princeton, grade A thinker, has written several books. And the most recent, in fact, I've got 4 of the books right here. He's written a book called The New Pilgrims, How Immigrants Are Renewing America's Faith and Values. Fantastic book. It's about questions about the border and questions about the spiritual texture of our country. A book here called Your Deepest Dreams, Discovering God's True Vision for Your Life. Very encouraging book. And then The Kingdom Net, Learning to Network Like Jesus. See, I bought all these books. And but most recently here, we have this book, fresh off the press, 2024. It's called The Sixth Great Awakening and the Coming Renewal of the American Church. So, Joe, welcome. Great to see you. And tell us about this book. What are you trying to say in it?
Well, first, I want to say how much I like this podcast. Man, this kind of podcast is so desperately needed in our time. And, the careful thought about the scriptures, careful theological reflection based on the biblical message is so important for the future of the church. We always have to be going back to the sources, ad fontes, they said in Latin, back to the scriptures, back to the original springs of our faith, and we can only do that by taking the scripture seriously. And this podcast is a great blessing to the kingdom. So I hope it grows in viewership by great margins. So back to the book, and your question was.
My question was, what's the thesis? The title is The Sixth Great Awakening. What is an awakening? Why have there been 5 of them? What does that even mean? What's the big idea?
That's definitely the right question. The big idea of the book is that in the next 15 to 20 years, America will go into another period of spiritual awakening along the lines of what we saw in the Jesus movement in the late 60s, early 70s through the 80s. Like what we saw in the 1880s with D.L. Moody and the student volunteer movement that sent 40,000 Americans off to the mission field as missionaries, was perhaps the greatest spiritual awakening in world history. Tremendous growth of the church. The church as we know it today is a product of that, what I would call the Fourth Great Awakening. But we're going to have another one in the next 15 to 20 years. I think 15 is probably a better guess than 20. But that's a very exciting prospect. And of course, the subtitle tells you what I think is going to happen before that, and that is the coming renewal of the American church. I believe that in the next 15 years, we're going to see remarkable revival in the church. I mean, tremendous moves of God throughout the country, across the kingdom, in all kinds of churches. A lot of people may not be aware that there's massive revival in the Roman Catholic Church right now. It's quite impressive.
Yeah.
So it isn't just going to be, the revivalist churches like, Pentecostals and others that are going to see this renewal of the church. It's going to happen across the kingdom of God and across all the categories. And that will happen in the next 15 years. And I feel strongly about it based on the patterns of American history.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit more about that. So there's a sort of a schematization of how history works in the background of your thesis. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so let's talk about what a Great Awakening is.
Okay.
If you look in Protestant church histories, you'll see mention of 2 Great Awakenings. It's actually for a church historian to see the title of my book, The Sixth Great Awakening. The question is, what in the world are you talking about? There's only been 2.
Right.
there are two things that Protestant church historians call Great Awakenings, and they are what's called the First Great Awakening in the 1720s through 40s. Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, they're the famous heroes of that awakening, and huge numbers of people came back to God during those years. Really set the tone for American church in the 1700s. And then the Second Great Awakening happened, and it began with a revival called the Cane Ridge Revival in Kentucky in about 1800. And that Cane Ridge Revival and the Second Great Awakening that came out of that created a religious America as we know it today. Thousands of Baptist and Methodist church planters came out of that movement, spread into the Western frontier, planted churches everywhere. And that awakening was, you can confine it to a 20-year period according to the model that I'm using, but the truth is it lasted quite remarkably through the 1840s. It did not die in the 1850s, despite other big things happening in the society. 1860s and 70s, there was tremendous spiritual things going on despite the societal trends, and then exploded again in the 1880s. So that Second Great Awakening really made the religious character of America as we've known it in the past, before the rise of the nuns and the sort of de-churching of America that we see now. So those are the two things that Protestant church historians call Great Awakenings. But when I use the word awakening, by the way, they don't define it. They just, by their light, it's just like that old definition of pornography. You know it when you see it. They didn't exactly define what an awakening was. They just called those two things Great Awakenings and sort of short shrifted the other things that they saw. When I use the word awakening, I'm using a definition that comes from the work of William Strauss and Neil Howe. Their theory is called Strauss-Howe generational theory, and it's very, very influential in America today. As a matter of fact, if you've heard the term Gen X, or if you've heard of the millennials or the baby boom, all of that comes out of Strauss-Howe generational theory.
I was on Amazon yesterday looking at this. It's the number one in like the demography charts, I think. And I mean, this is very well known. And it's actually like numbers 1, 2, and 5.
Yeah.
in this bracket of Amazon. So it's very influential.
Yes, it is very influential. And it's the main thing that people use to tell the future in America today, because that theory suggests a cyclical pattern of history. Historians from the get-go have tried to figure out what the cyclical patterns of history are. But in my view, the most credible one ever come up with is Strauss and Howe. And they see, they measure history by periods called ages or secula. We get the word secular from the Latin word seculum, which means the age. That same concept was present in Greek culture. It was called the aeon. We call it an age. The Hebrews called it your days. The time when you're alive, that's your age. I know exactly what my age is. I'm 64 years old, and I don't know when my age will end, but I know how long it's lasted.
Okay.
Most human beings live about 80 years, 70 to 80 years. Some of them will live to 100. And according to Strauss and Howe, ages have lasted between 80 and 100 years over the course of history.
Is that is that going through the whole turn, or is that one phase?
Yeah, let me explain that. An age, according to their theory, has 4 periods in it, or 4 seasons, you might call them, or turnings, as you just used the technical word that they use. Okay. Those 4 turnings are 20-year periods that follow a fairly predictable sequence. It's actually akin to the seasons of the year. A winter, followed by a spring, followed by a summer, followed by an autumn. We know that natural time is cyclical that way. You're always going to have those 4 seasons, at least in the northern and southern parts of the world. You're always going to have those seasons in the same order. Similarly, in history, they say that there are highs. Those highs are like spring. Highs are characterized by national victory, by maybe an economic boom, a period of good feeling. Those times are often called golden ages. And so the Gilded Age back in the 1800s was one of those high times.
Mm-hmm.
The golden age of capitalism, 1945 to 1965, was one of those high times. But highs, when people are prospering economically, their children start having great spiritual hunger, because everybody thinks money's the answer to your problems until you get some.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get some money and you still have the problems.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you can't see it, your kids will see it.
Mm-hmm.
So the children of a boom tend to start having a new spiritual hunger. And that spiritual hunger that follows a boom is called an awakening. They happen about every 80 years, every time they cycle back around. After an awakening, which lasts about 20 years, you tend to have an unraveling.
Mm-hmm.
And then after 20 years of unraveling, you get into a crisis. And the crisis will last for about 20 years. And when the crisis is resolved, you'll have a new release of power, a release of economic activity, and you'll see another high or boom.
Does this apply primarily just in American history, or is this global history? Or
it's applicable in other places, but Strauss and Howe trace it back through medieval history, back to medieval times. Now, this isn't it isn't guaranteed. Major disruptions can mess up the cycles badly. But America and Britain especially have had pretty predictable cycles for at least the last 800 years. And America in its 400 years has followed these cycles. I think their reading of the cycles, I think, is very compelling. Let me say this about any social theory or any theory of history, any social science theory. It will be more or less useful. Theoretical perspectives don't tell us the absolute truth. They give us a framework for interpreting reality. That framework is never going to fit reality perfectly because, if you think about it, we can't reduce reality to words.
Right.
Reality is what it is, and you can describe it with words, but all verbal depictions of reality both represent it and falsify it.
Yeah.
So any social theory that you come out with is going to explain some things, but not explain other things. And obviously, as Christians, we believe God is the sovereign of history, and God can do anything He wants to, anytime He wants to. But I think that this theory is a really helpful way of looking at how history tends to repeat itself, and has proven to be an extremely effective way for predicting what's going to come. As a matter of fact, this turn away from the sort of postmodern neo-Marxist thinking of the last 20 years, this turn away from it in the election here recently is something that Strauss-Howe theory predicts pretty effectively.
And many call it the Great Awakening.
well, that's what they called the period before. That period before now, that was called the Great Awakening. But pretty much everybody agrees that it's over. Both left and right agree that the Great Awakening is over. It's kaput.
Interesting. So one of the things that you mentioned about the Strauss-Howe theory is how corresponding with these different periods are different generational archetypes for how young people who are young people in the crisis or in the unraveling define themselves, and the characteristic of the generation is either like prophetic or artistic or. Can you say a little bit more about heroic? What is that?
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting piece of the theory. Along with those seasons that we talked about, there are also a cycle of generations. And the events of history tend to define what a generation looks like. Now, the notion of generations is not an arbitrary thing. It's as real as, you think about a day's 24 hours exactly, because that's how long it takes for the Earth to revolve on its axis.
Yeah.
A year is roughly 365 days because that's how long it takes the Earth to orbit around the sun. And of course, the seasons are tied to that orbit around the sun. So those things aren't arbitrary, they're real. Generation, an age is also a real thing. You live and you die. Once you die, your age is over. It's a real thing. And in the same way, generations are incorrigibly real. And every human being that's ever lived has noticed and lived with this renovation of the human race that happens in every new generation that's born. It's precious to families. There's grandparents just rave over their grandchildren. They're so thrilled to see those grandchildren born. And why should we be so nutty about a new generation coming on? Well, it's the survival of our race. You know, it's a really important thing. So generations are as old as human beings are, and each generation looks different than the one before it. And we've always wondered, why is there in the 70s we called it the generation gap?
Mm-hmm.
Why was this new generation so different in values compared to their parents?
Mm-hmm.
And that's been a mystery throughout human history. Why are kids so different today? Mm. And if you're a baby boomer like me, you look at Gen X and they're really different than we were. And then the millennials are really different too, but they're more like us than Gen X is. And then you look at the Gen Z, and Gen Z is really different than the millennials and very different from the other generations that are alive today. What is it that makes generations think differently? I mean, we share the same history. Mm-hmm. Like all the living generations right now went through COVID, all of them. Mm-hmm. Why do they think so differently about all these things? Mm-hmm. And according to Strauss and Howe, they think differently about them because they experience them at different times in their life.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the World War II generation. The World War II generation, when they were young adults in their early 20s, mostly in their early 20s, they got to go fight World War II. Now, that may not sound like much of a privilege, but it gave them a huge opportunity to be heroes. Early in their life, they defined themselves over that heroic task of going and saving the world from Hitler and the Emperor of Japan. And they came back as great heroes from that endeavor. And they became known as the greatest generation. They were so confident. They believed they could do anything.
Yeah.
And they even believed you could put a man on the moon. And who did they put on the moon? They put the next generation on the moon.
Yeah.
The next generation wasn't a hero generation like the World War II generation was. They grew up as children during World War II. They grew up with rationing and deep self-sacrifice for the good of the society, and a very strong federal government that told them what they could do and what they couldn't. And they were a very conformist generation, and they did what they were told to do. They got completely skipped in the presidential politics. Unless you count Jimmy Carter as one of them.
I remember you mentioning that.
Jimmy Carter's a scene character. He could be World War II generation or after. But that generation didn't serve as president. They skipped straight from Ronald Reagan, the World War II era guy, to Bill Clinton. You told me with ever.
In the book you said with Carter, when the American public chose Reagan, they actually went back a generation.
That's exactly
and said, no,
right.
this doesn't work. We want one of the greatest generation guys here.
They did that generation was called the silent generation, and they were not seen as adequate leaders.
So of those 4 generational archetypes, which I guess it's the nomad, the heroic, the artist, and the prophet, Howe and Strauss are saying 2 of them are like assertive and 2 are recessive, or 2 are a little bit more pliant, right?
Right.
The nomads and the artists are less assertive. The heroes and the prophets are like, no, we're going to shape history. Is that correct?
That's the theory. And so if you look at what actually happened after the silent generation, you had the baby boom, and they were a prophet generation. And just as the theory predicts, they had the Jesus movement, the charismatic renewal, and the consciousness revolution, and they were crusaders, man. They were very, very spiritually oriented, and they went out and changed the world.
So, like the consciousness revolution, that refers to like Krishna consciousness and so forth, right?
Oh, well, that, and also LSD use and all the rest.
Yeah, that kind of consciousness. So the point is, these spiritual awakenings aren't confined to Christianity. They're actually awakenings in many different religious outlets, correct?
That's a really important factor in the theory, that when an awakening happens, all spiritual options are favored. Mm-hmm. That is to say, a rising tide lifts all boats, is the way I put it in the book. And
Yeah.
When we saw the Jesus movement break out in the late 60s, early 70s, there were also Hare Krishna. There was
Right.
there was a huge increase in Buddhism and Hinduism in America. People were seeking in all kinds of different directions. The New Age movement was born during that time, and so people were looking for spiritual answers everywhere. And Christianity was in a good position to take advantage of that spiritual hunger, and saw tremendous growth. Millions and millions of people flooded into the kingdom of God and back into the churches during the Jesus movement. So it doesn't have to happen that way. We've had awakenings in the history of the world that didn't wind up favoring the church, and in some countries, Christianity was essentially eradicated or reduced to second-tier citizens.
Like
in the Muslim world, for example.
Right,
all those
right.
countries that are currently Muslim used to be Christian, but in that spiritual awakening, Islam was the one that won the game, and Christianity was so weak it was just swept off the board practically. So we can't assume that the next Great Awakening, what I call the Sixth Great Awakening, we can't assume that it's going to be good news for the church. The church is going to have to get ready for it, and we've got a little time, but we need to be very serious.
Yeah. One of the things, just one comment and then a question. One of the things I found fascinating about your book is pointing out that the American founding in the 1770s, 1780s was actually a spiritual dry period. And the Second Great Awakening on the far end really rekindled that from a Christian standpoint. But that because very often you'll hear we're a Christian nation, our founders were Christians and so forth. But America as a people in this part of the world had already been here for like 150 years or so before the Revolutionary War. Yeah. And there was the early fervor, the Puritans and so forth, then that 1700 awakening. But by the time of Washington and Jefferson and all these guys, that is not a spiritual high watermark. Is that correct?
It is not. There's an interesting.
That's fascinating.
America at its heart is a combination of Rousseau and Locke. Rousseau, the atheist skeptic, rationalist, and Locke, the profoundly pious evangelical Christian, as it were. And America's been fighting between those two options since the very beginning.
Fascinating.
The founders of our country were Christian-ish. They had a Judeo-Christian culture. They read the Bible, but you don't have an Orthodox Christian, heartfelt Christian, or born-again Christian in the presidency until Franklin Pierce. Not one. If you look at Washington, he went to the Episcopal Church because it was the thing to do, but he did not believe in the divinity of Jesus. His real religious conviction was that he was a Mason, and a very advanced one. John Adams was a Unitarian. He didn't believe in the divinity of Jesus. Thomas Jefferson was, he was Christian-ish, but he was really a deist and didn't really believe in the.
And he revised the Bible however he wants it, and so forth.
Right. He revised the Bible however he wanted it, and then of course Madison and Monroe. There's not a single word written by either one of them about religion.
In fact, I think Madison or Monroe, I can't remember which one. One of the only people who did not swear on the Bible in their inauguration, they swore on like the Constitution. Yeah, they said I'm not, or they swore on a law book. I'm not swearing on the Bible. Which is interesting to me.
Well, the first person who claimed to be an evangelical Christian was Andrew Jackson, but it doesn't take a whole lot of analysis to show that Jackson got saved for political reasons.
Yeah, he wasn't a great guy.
No, he wasn't. He was not a Christian.
for those like myself who are fuzzy on this, what the heck are the Masons? Can you give us a little blurb on the Masons?
The Masons are a secret society. It's actually quite ancient, and it's essentially it's a sort of form of Islam. You'll see that in the Shriners, and they'll wear their Muslim hats, and they'll name their mosque after, they call their places a mosque.
Did they really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, and so it's really a variant of Islam. It's not the kind of Islam that we're used to today, the Wahhabi kind or the fundamentalist kind, but it's a very free-thinking form of Islam that basically rejects the divinity of Jesus. Now, a lot of Mormons, excuse me, not Mormons, but Masons. A lot of Masons will deny that and say that Masons isn't any of that stuff, but at the bottom it is. And it's, people disagree about whether Christians can be Masons, but in my denomination, we're asked not to be.
Interesting.
It's not a Christian thing, but not being Christian doesn't mean it's bad necessarily, but you want to be careful with the Masons.
There's a big, beautiful Mason building, lodge, mosque, whatever, in downtown San Francisco, right across from Grace Cathedral. This is a stunning building, location and everything. And they got the Mason symbols, which is goes back to Solomon's temple on the outside. I understand the compass, the drafting compass and all that. I think that's correct.
Right.
Okay. So here's the question that I have. When I grew up, my dad's a Pentecostal pastor, and every once in a while we would have revivals, and we would go, and there'd be a literal tent, and it'd be night after night of church. And honestly, I didn't like it. And I thought it was kind of freaky. Maybe I just didn't like the conviction of the Holy Spirit in my life. I don't know. But for those, I don't think for many people, the idea that a revival's coming is either good news or even really makes sense. Yeah. So can you what is the difference between a revival and an awakening, or are those the same thing? And then for those of us who've never experienced that or have had weird experiences with that, tell us what is good about that and why it's something we should yearn for.
Well, let's start with the tents, and then we'll move to the definitions.
Okay.
Tent revivals are an odd happening that it is an attempt. It's a nostalgic attempt to bring back something from the past into the present. It's about remembering revivals of the past and somehow asking God to do among us the same thing that we heard He did among our grandparents or Christians of previous times. And anytime people come together and pray and seek God, a real revival can happen. But revivals don't have anything to do with tents or adopting old practices or singing older music. If you, it's a funny thing. We know from brain science that people will always like the music that they liked when they were 12, 13 years old. That will always be their favorite music for the rest of their life because it's imprinted in their brain.
For me, it's Switchfoot. This is a rock Christian band from the 90s, 2000. And they're still around, but man, I love Switchfoot so deeply. That was my young music.
So when older people hear that music from their youth that they associate with the presence of God, they often will remember that presence of God and even feel it anew. But that doesn't mean anything to younger people. When an awakening happens, it's always going to be up to the moment. It's not going to be some repetition of some old thing. New technologies are always involved. It's always going to be up to the date. And, so let's distinguish a revival from an awakening.
Okay.
As we've said, an awakening is a cyclical thing that happens every 80 years. People have figured out that money isn't the answer to their problems. They turn to spiritual pursuits, and the society changes. Could be Christian or not Christian. Revival is a manifest presence of God in a place and among a people that brings incredible excitement to them and renewal of their faith. When God shows up on the scene in a way that people just say, God is here, that's revival. It's an interesting thing. I had Chinese students coming to my university here for several years. So we've got about 60 Chinese students currently. And the Chinese students were sending word home that God was in the Northwest University Chapel. So one of the older Chinese people from that community came and visited the campus, and he said, I hear that God is in your chapel. And I said, yeah, He's there. And he says, well, I want to experience that. So I took him to chapel, and, he saw people worshiping around him with their hands raised up and singing off the words off of the screen. And so he raised his hands up and began to sing the words off the screen. And he had a profound experience of the reality of God in that chapel service. Later in the day, as I debriefed him on it, I explained the gospel in greater detail and was able to pray and help him come to Christ. And that was a revival in his life. God showed up and it changed his life.
Mm-hmm.
But that can happen in the life of an individual person, that they have a spiritual experience that revives them, that gives them a new sense
Mm-hmm.
of zeal for God and a new sense of hope. But at the level of churches, revival happens when publicly God shows up and everybody knows that God has manifested himself. It usually happens after a season of prayer, where somebody's been praying for revival, because God always hears his saints. And when people are praying for revival, revival is going to happen. It may not be on cue. It may not be when we wanted, but when people are praying for revival, there's going to be a revival. God's going to reward that prayer. And so when the manifest presence of God is revealed, people experience the holiness of God, and it leads to repentance. You'll see Christians repenting of their sins. You'll see unbelievers repenting of their sins. That is the quintessential mark that revival's happening, is that there's repentance going on.
Mm-hmm.
And people are changing their lives. Christians maybe stop spending so much time on petty entertainments, and they start getting hungrier for the Bible, hungrier for worship, hungrier for fellowship with other Christians. One of the things that happens is that Christians start sharing their faith more. And during revival, Christians just want to tell people what they're experiencing. They want to get them to church. They're inviting them to church because they know if they can get to the church, they're going to experience that manifest presence of God. They're going to be struck by their need for God. They're going to repent of their sins. They're going to accept Jesus. So people start witnessing all over the place. They start telling other people about Jesus. And consequently, people start coming to Jesus. And you have an influx of new believers into the church that raises everything. It raises the temperature of everything. There is no better thing that can happen to a church than new believers coming in. It raises everyone.
Not transfer growth from, the church down the street, but like brand new people. Yes.
Oh, absolutely. Because what happens when people get saved and they come to Jesus and they experience God in this real way, they tell all their family, they tell their friends.
Right.
And they start coming to see, because they notice this real change in the lives of the person they love. And they want to know more about this. Sometimes they come hostile.
Yeah, right.
But they'll even come to church hostile and go away believers.
We had a little story. We have a Spanish congregation here at our campus, and I know that's near and dear to your heart. And we've got in our leadership team a woman who's a gifted preacher, and her name is Nisa. And Nisa was preaching maybe about a year ago, and a man came for the first time who, when he saw that a woman was going to be preaching, he was really in a huff and not happy about this. And but he sat there through it, and by the end, he was just weeping. And like her sermon had really accessed something in his heart and changed. And now he's like BFFs with her, like her biggest fan. But that's just an example of somebody with hostility coming in saying like, "Oh, I'm not into this," and God changing something in a beautiful way.
Yeah. So revivals and awakenings are two very different things, and they can't happen at the same time. I mean, what's ideal for the church is to have revival at the same time as an awakening is going on, because that's what brings people to. An awakening doesn't bring people to Jesus. It's the reality of God that does.
So let me just see if I'm saying this correctly. Awakening is a societal. It's the language from Strauss and Howe. No, is that their language?
Yeah.
Awakening? Okay.
Yeah.
It is a societal yearning for spiritual things. It goes in a variety of different directions. And the revival is the Christian expression of the awakening. Is that correct?
No. Revival stands on its own feet. It can happen anytime. This is the beautiful thing about revival.
I see.
Awakenings happen about every 80 years. They're pretty predictable. But revivals can happen at any time. And that's why I'm saying in this next 15 to 20 years before the next Great Awakening hits, we need revivals in the church. We need the church to be fully revived and psyched up and ready to go, excited about Jesus, so that when the awakening hits, we're out there doing our thing. And, sharing the gospel, bringing people to church. And when revival happens at the same time as an awakening, and that's what's happened in all five of the previous awakenings in America. The church has been ready, and that's really been an incredible grace to us. I mean, revivals happen when God says so. Revivals happen because God shows up on the scene by His grace, not because we deserve it, not because we've earned it, not because we've prayed, not because we've evangelized or put up a tent or any of those kind of things. A revival happens because God graciously visits His people, and all that good stuff happens with it.
Now, is there anything? So it's enormously exciting, your thesis, and obviously it cuts against a common narrative that you hear that the church is going down, or that the nuns, it's plateaued, the church is becoming irrelevant. And I think your book pretty strongly puts that idea to rest. And but what I'm wondering is, if there is a great awakening on the horizon in 15 to 20 years, which you've convinced me, is there anything that we can do to prevent, on the back end of that, a new season of disintegration or whatever it's called, and then another crisis? Like, is there any way that we can not seed into the awakening the seeds of its eventual demise?
Oh, that's brilliant. That's a brilliant question. It's exactly the right question. The answer is that even in a great awakening, most people aren't going to come to Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to have a great awakening that saves the whole country and brings in the millennium.
Mm-hmm.
Human nature is not going to change. Not everybody's going to get saved. That's just the nature of history. I mean, I believe that we won't have a millennium. We won't have a period of perfection on earth until Jesus sets His foot on it again. Until Jesus returns, we're not going to see everything perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And a new great awakening isn't going to make everything perfect. What it is going to do is result in the salvation of millions, and literally tens of millions.
Yeah.
Maybe 100 million people in America. But it won't save everybody. And with time, the cycle will reestablish itself as to the society.
Right.
That doesn't mean that churches have to fall apart. Churches can go on and on and on through the seasons of society. Churches can remain strong. They can be full of revival. There's no reason that a church can't have 100 years of revival. People do get tired, though. It's hard to keep revival going all the time. It just is. It's hard to do, but it doesn't mean it's impossible. And as I was saying about the 1800s, the Second Great Awakening. It's funny. Strauss and Howe date it differently than I do. I date it from a church history perspective, and I say it starts in 1800. Strauss and Howe think it starts in 1824. They're wrong. But the funny thing about it is that Great Awakening, that Second Great Awakening, it didn't stop. The growth of the church didn't stop. Its influence on society didn't stop. The abolitionist movement came out of that Second Great Awakening, but it really hit its heyday during the 1840s when the unraveling was beginning to really happen fast. 1850s, the unraveling was over, and the crisis began by the end of the 1850s with Civil War. But there were Great Depressions during the 1850s, and the worst president in American history, James Buchanan, horrible failure of leader.
Also a huge gold rush in California during the 1850s, and people by the hundreds of thousands picking up from everywhere and just saying, we're going to go up into the Sierra Nevadas and find gold.
Right. Well, those are the years of the Wild West too, really.
Yeah.
Starting then, that's when the birth of the Wild West is happening, and there's no lawlessness out on the frontier, and that crisis from 1845, before the Mexican-American War, and ending with the Civil War, into the Civil War, that was a tremendous time of crisis, the worst we'd ever seen, for sure.
Yeah. So I've got another question. So your analysis in the book is primarily targeted at the American church.
Yeah.
But as you know, you travel a lot. The American church is simultaneously just one global expression of Christianity, and it is also an enormously influential expression of global Christianity. I mean, I've been to churches in India, in the Philippines, or not the Philippines, excuse me, in China, that are like basically walking out of an American evangelical church, and there's the forms, the styles of church are very similar. So I guess what I'm wondering is if these cycles don't necessarily apply in other cultures, how do you anticipate the Sixth Great Awakening in the American church reverberating or not with the global church in that time? Because I think a lot of, one of the things that as a pastor I see a lot and that I've had to work through in my own heart is, what is the relationship between my Christianity and my nationality?
Yeah.
And really come into clarity that, like, I'm a follower of Jesus far before I'm an American.
Mm. And
so while the idea of an awakening of the American church excites me, and for what it would do for my country, I love my country. The sort of the American dimension of it seems to, for me, is quite secondary.
Uh-huh.
And I'm very interested in the global church. I'm very interested in the Chinese church, in the Indian church, in the African church, South American church. So how do you anticipate these social dynamics that are local to our country and its fairly short history interacting with the rest of the world?
I talk a lot to people in other countries. I just got back from China and Korea and had really interesting talks about this in both China and Korea. I recently had a very interesting talk about, I'll be speaking in Argentina in January, and I've been thinking a lot about Argentinian history and how it fits the model. And the truth is, anything that explains everything explains nothing, right?
Yeah.
So we don't want to make this a universal theory of everything.
I wish more social scientists would be upfront and clear about that.
Yeah.
There's not much disciplinary humility among social scientists in my experience.
You hold these things with a grain of salt. You do. They're either useful to you or they're not. And if you look at the world history, if you look at the world culture across the board, you'll see that there are two cultures going on simultaneously in the world. One is the sort of postmodern urban culture that's pretty much shared everywhere in the world.
Yeah.
And then there's a rural culture, rural traditional culture that can be quite different.
Yeah.
So you might have in the same country, let's say India, in the cities it may be tracking on a sort of cosmopolitan global scale, whereas in the countryside it may feel like it's 1,000 years ago.
Right.
So nothing's going to fit everything everywhere. But I think across global urban culture, I think this theory holds up pretty well. Because I think about the rest of the world a whole lot. As you know, I'm very attuned to global things because I've spent so many years living out of the country. It does that to you. You're always thinking about the rest of the world.
Yeah.
In this book, I focused on America because it's my country. It's where I live, and I think this theory is helpful. But I also think it's helpful. And one of the things that will happen is when America gets its next great awakening and the revivals that lead up to it, it's going to create tremendous missionary fervor again in America. American missionary fervor has been hurt by the loss of people believing that people are lost.
Right.
I mean, your average Christian walking around America doesn't really believe people are lost anymore.
Right. Yes.
When revival happens, you realize how lost everybody is.
Yeah.
You just realize that when you experience the holiness of God up front and personal, and you are struck with that heart of repentance that happens when you encounter the holiness of God, you realize how lost the world is.
One of the things fascinating me in your book is, you trace a lot of different trends. And again, if you're listening, I encourage you to get this book and read it. Is the trend of public intellectuals who are coming to faith.
Yeah.
Who, I mean, these people have big platforms, high-powered thinkers. And, there was a student that I had when I was at Harvard who was an undergrad. I was a doctoral student. And this guy came from an atheist background, philosophy major, very, very bright. And he became a Christian during his time at Harvard. And he decided to become a missionary, like a foreign missionary. And he went to seminary afterwards and has trained his whole life towards being a missionary abroad. And for me, unless I'd have seen that in person, I'd have been like, no, that doesn't happen. But it does happen where people who are very, very bright, and you mentioned many people from, Jordan Peterson to I've got all the names underlined. Neil
Ferguson,
Ferguson,
one of the four horsemen of new atheism.
Yeah,
vibrant believer now.
Yeah, I mean, so it reminds me of a time where like Reinhold Niebuhr was in his heyday and highly respected as a Christian thinker, neo-Orthodox thinker. He turned down a professorship at Harvard, but he was at Columbia for a really long time, lectured at Stanford and so forth. Like, I mean, in the establishment, Christianity was taken very seriously. And as someone who loves theology, I yearn for a time where it's not that theology has to be the queen of the sciences again in a medieval sense, but in a way, well, in fact, there's this group at Harvard called the Institute for Human Flourishing or something like that.
Yes.
And my sister's involved in it, actually. She's a research scientist there. It's run by Tyler Vander Weely, very interdisciplinary, but it is part of this movement of, it's very interdisciplinary, but social scientists, hard scientists who are saying it is indubitable. You cannot disprove that being a person of faith across the board increases your life flourishing. Like, yeah. So, okay, great. Let's speak the language of data. The data shows demonstrably that this changes things. And because maybe it's true.
Right.
And so there's
that phenomenon of Christian atheism that's going on right now because atheists, including Richard Dawkins, have come to understand that there is no basis for Western society except Christianity. And if we don't return to church, if we don't return to Christianity, the West is lost.
Right. So, this is Tom Holland and Dominion and all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great book. Yep. Oh, it's very true. Although there's, the hardcore seculars, there's a guy named Peter Gordon. He's a philosopher at Harvard who has taken a very hard stand to say, no, secularism, modern secularity owes nothing to a Christian legacy. There's been a complete break because they're very interested in sanitizing themselves from anything that has to do with a Christian legacy.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting. But I've only encountered that in very, very narrow, sort of like academic discussions.
Yeah.
It seems to me that the broader consensus is like, well, yeah, it is kind of Christian, and we kind of can't ignore that.
The zeitgeist is totally headed in our direction.
It is. Or, it's like a Thomas Kuhn paradigm shift where it's like, I mean, it's across the board. Jordan Peterson just came out with a book about his sort of psychoanalytic Jungian reading of the book of Genesis, We Who Wrestle with the Gods. There's another book by David Bentley Hart recently out that's called All Things Are Full of Gods. And it's about consciousness. So it's philosophy of mind.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, like engaging with hard-hitting, philosophers of mind and basically saying materialism doesn't work. Like it simply doesn't work. And so I really am excited for the way the plausibility structures are changing in terms of the world that my children will grow up in. What sorts of things are legit to say that you can put a little sticker on it and says the science shows. Anyways, I'm very excited about this as a nerd and a scholar. I'm just like, dude, the ground is shifting and it's very exciting.
We're going to see huge culture shift in the next 15 to 20 years. It's going to be really remarkable. And I do think, I mean, most Christians that I talk to really want the Great Awakening now, and they will send me clips of college students at universities around the country worshiping, 1,000 of them at a time, or the baptisms at Ohio State here recently, and all that's really exciting. It's wonderful. That's revival.
Mm-hmm.
That's a beautiful thing, and we want to see more and more of it. But what I'm saying is that it's going to take 15 years for the whole country to get into that mode. There's a saying in Spanish: "One sparrow doesn't make it spring." And to push the analogy too far, I'd say all the sparrows don't make it summer.
Yeah.
It's going to take a while to get to that summer awakening.
So
all of this is just signs. Again, as I was saying in the book, the fact that these artists and intellectuals are coming to Christ in bigger and bigger numbers, it usually takes 15 to 20 years for the popular culture to pick up on what scientists and artists and intellectuals are thinking.
Totally.
Yeah.
Now, one of the trigger you identify from a high to an awakening is that people who thought money would solve everything come to realize, oh, it doesn't. Does that sort of disillusionment process apply in other domains? That is to say, I wonder if people will think that AI or technology or something, oh, if I only get that, it'll solve everything in my life. But then once you get that, you'll realize that it leaves you impoverished as well.
Oh, yeah.
Like, can that disillusionment mechanism apply not just to money, but to other things?
I think AI is going to drive people back to humane things.
I agree. I 100% agree.
I wouldn't be surprised to see a sort of neo-Amish movement happening where people just basically said, no, we're going back to doing everything ourselves. We don't want AI to rule us. That won't be the majority, but there will be pockets of that. People just forming communities that want to live conventional lives and don't want to be AI driven. And I think a lot of people will go back to playing musical instruments and writing poetry. You remember, every society on earth has written poetry until we get to now, and now nobody values it anymore, and some people do it, especially teenagers. But who's writing poetry or reading it anymore? I think that poetry could have a real return in the next 15 years, especially during the awakening after that. I think we're going to see. We're going to see the humanities just roar back. And I say that in the book, too.
Yeah, I remember you saying that the disciplines like philosophy, history, religion, these things will become actually not steamrolled by STEM disciplines.
I want to be clear that I'm not against AI, and I'm looking forward to having robot. I've got a robot vacuum cleaner now, and it does a good job. And I don't mind the robot doing all the things I don't want to do, but what am I going to do with myself when I don't have any chores?
Exactly.
That's the real question. What are you going to?
Right.
You going to get absorbed into the internet and become an addict of games or pornography or some other noxious thing? And not that games are noxious at the same level, but But you can get absorbed into cyberspace or endlessly streaming on X or some stupid like that. Or you can shake yourself and get back to doing something human.
Right. Yeah, this is what's driving a lot of the flourishing movement to say, like, okay, life expectancy in the last 150 years has gone from like 40-something to like 80-something. Great, we're living longer. But are we living better? Or is like that extra 40 years of life we're on average living, is it really rich living? And then often the answer is no. Yeah. So how do we live truly human lives? And that's like a perfect entree question for thinking biblically and thinking in terms of category of image bearing and vocation and royal priesthood. And, there's just people are asking the types of questions that the Bible is written to answer. And that's very exciting.
And, we haven't really talked too much about the Bible in the Deeper Bible podcast here as we've addressed this theory, but I do want to get back to this, that what is crucial for us to do in preparing for the next Great Awakening is certainly pray like crazy.
Yeah.
But taking the Bible seriously is absolutely necessary. If we're going to pastor a Great Awakening, we've got to be giving them pure milk and meat. We need to be giving them what the scriptures actually say.
Yes.
There is so much pop culture corruption of the gospel as we know it in our society today.
Yeah.
You see politically people on both sides of the political aisle excusing behavior that is absolutely unbiblical and unacceptable.
Yes.
There may be people may feel a political necessity to excuse that bad behavior, but if that becomes our norm, if that becomes, what we're saying is okay at church, well, then that's a real problem.
Yes.
And we really have to get back to looking at the scriptures deeply and understanding them on their own terms and not just in terms of what our culture gives us.
Yeah. One of the observations in the book is that the young generation, Gen Z, Gen Zoom, you pointed out.
The Zoomers.
The Zoomers have to endure all that. Often get labeled as, oh, well, you have no attention span. You're a TikTok generation. But this is where Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson and others have shown like, oh no, people do have attention spans. And also highly sophisticated, multi-episode, multi-season TV shows that are like sophisticated. People get into that. So, I mean, I think about this a lot where people are like, well, keep that sermon to very short because people can't handle it. Says who?
Yeah.
Says who?
People will binge watch 8 episodes of a brand new season the day it comes out. Don't tell me they don't have attention spans.
Exactly. But it's that very same muscle that Christian preachers we have to understand the story of God. Because it is the storied mechanism, especially, is what keeps us hooked to shows and so forth. But the Bible is a story. So we got to learn to tell that story really, really well.
Well, this is one of the things that Peterson does really well is to show that meaning doesn't come from reason. Meaning comes from narrative. Meaning comes from a story.
Yeah.
And if you're telling a good story, everybody will listen. People don't lose their attention to a good story.
Totally.
If you're just up there spouting silly stuff, then people will get bored with that.
Totally.
But if you're preaching meaty stuff and you're doing it well and you're building a good narrative frame for it, that people will stay engaged. I preach long.
How long do you preach typically?
It depends on where I am, but I'll preach an hour if I'm in a Hispanic church because they want it.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah. And you try to preach to the time frame that you're given, but I never see when I'm an hour into a sermon, I don't see people like headed for the door or nodding off. They're engaged.
Yeah.
You can preach in such a way that keeps people's attention and keeps them wanting to hear the rest.
It's true. Although, as Oliver O'Donovan, a professor at Oxford, says, good preaching requires an act of self-annihilation and is incredibly hard work. And he says, and that's why there's so little good preaching.
Yeah.
Because, I think a lot of Christian preachers should be ashamed that a lot of other artists in different cultural spheres are far better in terms of just like the excellence or the intention or the skill level. So it's like it's incumbent on us to like learn to preach really good again.
Well, you've done such a wonderful job of that. I love listening to you.
I'm trying.
You do a great job.
Thank you.
But yeah, we've got to take this seriously. We've got to take storytelling seriously as a Christian a priority. It's good.
I was thinking back to the generational archetypes, which is, and the fact that at any given moment in a community, there are 4 to 5 different generations living synchronously. And I think that's beautiful. That's a sort of a secular way of talking about the body of Christ, that you need your artists. You need your heroic run into the wall kind of people. You need your prophetic people. You also need your nomads or your introverted, introspective people. So, I mean, it's like, it's good that all of those things come together in a church, in a society.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
Well, it's fascinating how Gen X, Gen X has been vilified since the 90s. I remember when they first identified Gen X and they said,
is that you? Are you Gen X?
No,
what are you?
I'm a baby boomer.
You're a baby boomer.
I love Gen X, man.
Okay.
Gen X was, people said they would never be organizational leaders, and mostly they haven't been. It's very likely that we'll never have a Gen X president of the United States. If J.D. Vance gets elected on his own, it'll be millennials then for a long time.
Yeah, wow.
But it's very possible that none of the Gen X politicians will ever be president. But Gen X is a marvelous generation. You look at what they've done in totally creating the world of podcasting and Joe Rogan, Dave Rubin, Jordan Peterson himself, I count as Gen X. He's born in 1962, so he's an early Gen Xer. Those guys have turned communications completely around, and they created the long form podcast. And who are the consumers of that? Gen Z. In large measure, Gen Z are the consumers of those long podcasts. And it's fascinating how the generations appeal to each other. The recessives appeal to the recessives, and the dominants appeal to the dominants.
Interesting.
The baby boomers feel like they understand millennials better than Gen X, and Zoomers understand Gen X better than they do us Okay, boomers.
It's almost like birth order psychology applied to the generations or something like that, you know? It's
it's an interesting thing.
Yeah.
But all the generations have their own mystique, their own value. God is going to use all of them. As I say in the book, Gen Z is going to pastor the next generation. They're going to pastor the next Great Awakening. And so the church has no greater task right now than to capture the imagination of Gen Z and raise up a generation of Gen Z pastors who will be fully conversant with our tradition, who understand the scriptures, who know how to pray, and can take the Gen Alpha that will experience the awakening, take them and make them into a missionary force that will be the greatest one the world's ever seen.
Wow. Man, I got to sit with that for a while, and just that's. I mean, I'm a millennial pastor. I turned 37 shortly, and just thinking about what all this means and what the possibility is. And I love the phrase you used, capturing the imagination. That's the most important. Andy Stanley talks about this, designing a church a church that's designed to capture the imagination of unchurched unbelievers. And I'm short of words because there's just a lot there for me to think about in terms of my task as a pastor. Okay, well, maybe we should land the plane about here. Thank you so much for taking time to share this with us. This is exciting stuff. Let me hold up for those who are watching this, some will podcast it, but the book is called The Sixth Great Awakening and the Coming Renewal of the American Church by Joseph Castleberry. And you can get this on Amazon, yes? And,
yes.
And similar places. Get it. Okay. And just some, honestly, I mean, I would put this in the category of genuine prophecy in the real sense of trying to discern God's ways in the world and where things are going and how we can participate. And so high recommend. And thank you, Joe. Really, really appreciate you spending time with us. And we'll be on our knees here in California praying alongside you guys up in Seattle.
I'm so excited about the future, man. I'm thrilled to turn over leadership to the generation coming.
Praise God. Praise God. All right. Well, let's put a pin in it there, friends. Thank you for joining today. I hope this was helpful. I can't imagine that it wasn't. If you believe in what Deeper's doing, if it's been helpful, we'd be grateful if you'd consider partnering with us, supporting. You can make a one-time financial gift or a recurring gift. It helps us with our team. We've got people who are making this happen, distributing it. We want to reach more people with this very exciting truth. So you could do that. And until next time, just want to say, as the ancient rabbi said, shalomi homies, take care. Bye-bye.